since he left MIT in the mid-1990s. We were colleagues for about, I don't know, maybe 12, 13 years. And we had probably daily discussions. Conversation is not quite the word, discussions about economics. And they were always incredibly exciting and surprising. And when you talk to Julio, he would say something you did not expect. It was different. And it was not different to be different. It was different because Julio thought about things in a different way. And very often he was completely right. I'm going to, I know I had another sentence here which I've forgotten, so I'm going to, I don't want to. Yeah, so what I said about the discussions we had applied to his research. He was made the Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association last year, and the description said that he was one of the preeminent new Keynesian economists, and I think that's actually not at all the right description, in the sense that, yeah, he did some important work with Michael Woodford on new Keynesian stuff, but he was much broader than the very dry new Keynesian framework, which has made it to the textbooks and elsewhere. And he was willing to go to places where I think very few of us were willing to go. For example, fairness in pricing, something that we think is relevant, but we're very scared of touching. Or altruism in wage determination. So all the places where we think these things are important, but we don't know how to do it. He actually plunged, and there's a stream of papers which are all as original as they can be. So I think there was, again, much more to Julio than the description which has been given of him in the American Economic Association. And there was something different and important about Julio, that it was his kindness and his smile. And I had an email from Jordi Galli who said that Julio was the only economist he knows who always smiled. And it's true, he had this nice smile, which basically was more an invitation for you to talk to him and have a discussion, and he kept it consistently. In a profession in which sometimes egos have a way of going wild, he had, as far as I can tell, no ego. He was perfectly happy to be himself and just talk. And when you talked to him, he listened, he enjoyed, he made you feel smarter, and he never made you feel bad, even if you said something completely stupid. That was something very special about him. So for all these reasons, I'm very sad that he's not with us, and I'll continue to think about him. So with this, I'm going to do something that he probably would not have approved, which is to talk about the topic which you saw the title of, Macro and Distortions. So, Rudy Dornbusch gave me very strong, he gave me a lot of advice on many things, strong advice. And one of his advice is never talk about methodology, just do it. I think but just do it is not his, but that's what he meant. Just do it, and if people like it, they like it. If they don't, don't. So I'm going to do it. But I'm going to do the methodology. I'm going to talk about methodology, although I think it might not be very wise. I think his advice was good. This is a very tough crowd to try things on, and my ideas are still quite fuzzy. So the combination may not lead to a complete success, but we'll see. So the theme of a talk is in that slide, which is, I think there has been convergence about the way we think about macro, which is we start with the general equilibrium model, and then we think hard about which distortions are relevant and then we look at the effects of shocks with those distortions. And the question is, do we have, at this stage, the right distortions? Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, it's clear that we have large models which have many, many distortions, but what are the fundamental distortions, which basically we need to explain fluctuations? Do we have the right ones or not? And I'm going to argue that maybe not, although I'm not going to give you the list of what we should have. I think that's too hard. But. So let me go back a bit in history. When I took macro in the early 70s, the approach was quite different. I mean, you basically had a lot of good partial equilibrium pieces on consumption behavior, on investment behavior. There was a Jorgensen Hall paper, which was the standard reference, on the wage price spiral separately and so on. So many of these models actually had a fairly tight theoretical structure. But when it came to actually putting things together, then the tight theoretical structure was in the background, and the models were a list of behavioral equations which were plausibly derived from theory, and then the general equilibrium model was simulated. There was no, I don't remember hearing the word distortions as playing an important role in the way people thought. We had good behavioral equations, and that was it. Then something happened, which is that because of Bob Lucas in particular, there was a focus on nominal rigidities. And then there was a set of models, I think the three models that I have in mind here are the Lucas imperfect information model, and then the Fisher and Taylor model on the fixed price or wage decisions. And these models did the right thing. They said, well, if we want to understand nominal rigidities, why is it that prices don't adjust? Let's just simplify all the way. And these models were incredibly simple. And they're basically, the Lucas one was a bit more complicated, but basically two equations. And there was one distortion about price setting of some sort, or some assumption about information. And the discussion took place in that much simpler environment rather than in the big models. It was exactly the thing to do in order to understand nominal rigidities. Then the next step was to integrate this with a general equilibrium model in which you had optimizing consumption and investment. And the RBC model was provided by Prescott. And then there was kind of a symbiosis of the RBC and the nominal rigidities, which led to the new Keynesian model. I've always thought that was a strange marriage, an odd couple. The notion the RBC is very pure, nominal rigidities is extremely ad hoc, but the combination of both gave a model with three equations which we could talk about. But again, it restricted the discussion very much to that environment. And I think that although initially it was incredibly productive, it became unproductive. So for a while, this looked like a winning strategy in terms of research. So the great moderation indicated that things, we understood things much better, we knew how to do policy better. In terms of the models that we were using, this was very much a one distortion and one instrument world. So the one distortion was the nominal rigidity, and the one instrument was the policy rate. Then you could kind of undo the distortion with the instrument, not always exactly depending on the details, but it was very close. So this is the way a lot of monetary policy, I think, was thought about, which is, again, very, very useful, but incredibly reductive. One distortion, one instrument, you can see that you're going to be able to do good things with that. Now, what I say is what is in the parenthesis, that's a bit of a caricature in the sense that although this model kind of dominated the central banks, there was a lot of work at the margins on stuff which was probably relevant but was not integrated. So, I've cited a few here. Bernanke Gertler, clearly on credit, Diamond Dybvig on bank runs, Holmstrom Tirol on liquidity, Rothenberg Woodford on markups, which turns out, I think, to be an important issue. But there was never any attempt to kind of integrate these in a more, at least in a simple more, in DSGs maybe, but not in a simple, not in a common conceptual frame. But you don't argue with success. Great moderation was there. The standard deviation of inflation decreased, the standard deviation of output decreased, so it looked like the model was very useful, and it was declared a great success. Now, what we know now, I think, is that it was maybe not so much of a success. I make 2 points here. The first one is, I've been looking for the English word, and I'm not sure if it's the right one, but it was an insidious success, in the sense that the arguments we gave for nominal rigidities really suggested deviations from standard behavior which were relevant for other parts of the economy. We just kept it to price and wage setting. But if you stayed with the Calvo specification, yes, but if you thought a bit more deeply about why it is that prices were not adjusted all the time, or wages were not adjusted all the time, it clearly had to do with bounded rationality, with things that we didn't say, but were probably the real reason. And as soon as you said that, it was not obvious why we should not apply this to consumption, to investment, to all the other pieces of it. So I always felt that there was a bit of a tension, but I lived with it. And then basically the failure came, which is the financial crisis, showed that model just didn't capture something, as you know. Until then, inflation had been kind of under control. Monsieur Trichet was extremely happy to basically have it at exactly 2%. And that was a great success, except that it did not prevent the financial crisis. So I think that the financial crisis forced all of us to rethink a bit what we had done. Whether we liked it or we didn't like it, it indicated that there were other things at play. And rather obviously, the financial sector was central. That was kind of a minimum of conclusion. But there were deeper issues. I mean, when we started thinking about solvency and liquidity, we realized that there were imperfections there which were important. As I say here, I was struck by the fact that when I taught, I would have one lecture about bank runs. But I saw this as a rather isolated issue. Yes, banks have demand deposits, so there's an issue, but it's easy to solve. You basically just provide liquidity or provide deposit insurance, and basically you're done. I think what we learned is that the issue behind bank runs is much more general, that liquidity issues affect all kinds of decisions, all kinds of financial actors. It's really something fundamental to the economy. So we had dismissed it. We had said we know how to handle it, but it turned out that the discussion about Lehman today, was it liquidity or was it solvency? Basically, was about issues like this. So this made me think, okay, so what was the role of the distortion we had insisted so much on previously, namely nominal rigidities? And I don't have the answer to this, but I think it's a good question, which is how would the financial crisis have looked if there were no nominal rigidities? How much of a downturn would we have, and would we have recovered faster than we did? This is a way of saying that maybe that other distortion is really just very, very important. Maybe not important all the time, but surely it was absolutely central. I think you could probably tell the story of a financial crisis in which nominal rigidities were not of the essence. They played a role, but I'm not sure they were of the essence. So what happened? Well, there was a lot of partial equilibrium work on the macro-financial linkages, which is, I think, very exciting. And then the DSGs were repaired. I think I'm tempted to put repaired in quotes, which is, okay, so we need a financial sector that just put something like Bernanke-Gertler in it and then see whether we can kind of fit the data better. But when it came to the core model that we use, not the big machines, I'm afraid that we never integrated this second of distortions in the model. And the question is, should we basically extend the set of distortions? Again, in a big model there can be many, but in a way we teach first-year graduate students what are the distortions that we really think should be there in the model that we teach. And I think that's an open issue. So one possibilities where we basically have overemphasized nominal rigidities, and really, I mean, there are people in this room, I think, who would say, well, we probably can explain the world without nominal rigidities. I still think this is a preeminent distortion. I just do not, as much as I've tried to look at the world without nominal rigidities and explain it, I've not been successful. I mean, I give you, 3 of the standard reasons for why I just cannot do without nominal rigidities. The first one is well known. It's the ability of central bank to basically keep the nominal rate or the real rate more or less as they want, not forever, we know that, but for a very long time, which presumably they could not do if there were no nominal rigidities. The second is the co-movement in investment consumption that we see in response to good news or bad news, which again is difficult to explain, surprisingly difficult to explain without aggregate demand and nominal rigidities playing a role. And then the third is an old line from Michael Musa, which is the amazing difference in the behavior of real exchange rates depending on the exchange rate regime, whether it's floating or fixed. Basically see enormous differences. And again, that says nominal something plays a big role. So my sense is we have to keep it as the main one. The question is what others? As the main one, like most of you, I'm extremely unhappy with the Calvo specification. I mean, it works, it's marvelous, it gives you a simple equation, but it's clear that there's much more behind it, and so I think we have to go back and think harder, and then draw the conclusions for the rest of the economy. If it's bounded rationality, then clearly we should apply this to consumption, for example, or something like this. Are there other distortions which are essential? My sense is yes, and rather than speculate, I thought this is the next to last slide. I would show how I can look at a particular macroeconomic event or fact with 3 different lenses depending on distortion that I look at. So one thing we know is that the neutral rate of interest has been coming down and is very low. So I think that we will accept that. Now I have this picture of not the neutral rate, but the actual policy rate, real 1-year interest rate, which is the red line. And as you can see, it's basically expected to be very low for a very long time. The blue line, I'll come back to it in a second, is the growth rate. So basically looking forward, we expect the growth rate to be fairly substantially above the real interest rate, the real policy rate. So the question is, what do we do with that fact? So if I'm kind of a straight new Keynesian, unimaginative macroeconomist, in the sense I take them all as it is and I just don't try to extend it, then what is the issue here? Well, the issue is that the neutral rate may be negative. We may not be able to achieve it. And I focus on the zero lower bound. And I spend my time thinking really hard about forward guidance as a way of getting expectations up. Or I do QE if I'm willing to relax the assumption of perfect substability between the assets. But that's a focus, right? That's what you do. If nominal rigidity is what you care about, what you think is the main distortion. Okay. But it seems to me that there are other ways of looking at it, and they lead to very different answers. The second one is, I would say, finite lives. I don't know if finite lives can be considered a distortion. That's nearly philosophical. But finite horizons, for whatever reason, so even if we live very long lives, we may not look very far in the future, is an environment in which strange things can happen. In particular, there can be dynamic inefficiency. And there's a temptation to look at the graph that I showed you and say, well, maybe what we have is an economy which is dynamically inefficient, right? So the distortion in this case is very different from nominal rigidities. It has to do with basically oversaving by people who are currently alive. If this is it, then it seems to me the policy recommendations are completely different from forward guidance or anything like this, right? I mean, basically there's too much capital in the economy and the government should basically issue debt a la diamond in order to reduce, to increase the equilibrium rate. Now, I think, unfortunately, this is not the reason why what you saw in the other graph happened, because one of the things that we have to introduce, I think, in any model that we play with is the difference between the marginal product of capital and the policy rate, the safe rate. And the evidence is overwhelming that the marginal product of capital, at least the average product of capital, is substantially above the growth rate. So we're not in a dynamically inefficient environment, so that some of what you would do in that environment you should not do. There still leads you to think quite differently about fiscal policy, but not quite in the same way as you would do under dynamic inefficiency. So this is a distortion which, if it was relevant, gives you a completely different way of thinking about policy. And then the third one, which I think is very relevant, as opposed to the second, which could have been but is not, is that there is just a very large liquidity or risk premium between the policy rate and the marginal product of capital. So, there has been some work by people in this room thinking about the demand for safe assets and so on. And if this is the case, I think what the configuration that we're in is that the marginal product of capital is probably greater than the growth rate. It is greater than the growth rate, and the growth rate is greater than R. And we have these two inequalities. And then the question is, what kind of policies you think about? And it seems to me, again, that you think about very different policies from the first two. You basically ask, and you basically go back to the Prescott equity premium puzzle, and you say, well, why is it so large? Is it so? I don't think that Ed had the answer, but it seems to me it has to do with plumbing of financial markets. But that leads you to look there. It could be that this is the right premium, in which case there's nothing to do in terms of policy, or it could be that it is that there are distortions which lead to a large premium, and then you think really hard about how can I decrease the premium, which would lead the policy rate to be higher, and the marginal product maybe to be a bit lower. In that environment, also, even if you don't solve that, you have this possibility that the government can finance itself at rate R, and therefore can sustain any level of debt. And basically, because for the government, as opposed to for the government, what's relevant is the rate at which it borrows, which is R. And if it's less than G, then that is sustainable no matter how much of a deficit you run. Now, again, we have to think about whether this is really the case or there's uncertainty and that cannot hold forever. But it leads you in the direction of thinking about whether the government should actually issue debt and just roll it over and never pay it back. Is it good? Is it bad? In that context, it's likely to be bad because if you're at full employment, you're going to basically take something else is going to decrease. And if it's private investment, then MPK is greater than R, and that's not, you're basically decreasing the marginal product of capital, which is not a good thing. But this is just an example of how basically looking at the same fact, but extending the set of distortions to include things that we often don't include in our model, you led to very different conclusions in terms of monetary policy or fiscal policy. And I think there's a conclusion side, which is a non-conclusion side. So I don't know what the answer is. Again, maybe this is not the right way to think about. Maybe we can't have a core model. Maybe we have to deal with kind of DSG, fairly large things, which have the distortions we want. But I suspect that that's probably not the answer. What I'm sure of is that we have to move away from basically the new Keynesian framework, because this notion that there's just one distortion, it's actually one distortion and a half, because there's monopolistic competition, but it doesn't play much of a role, is just makes things too good for the central banks. I mean, basically, it's the usual. One instrument, one target, and you get very close to what you want. That's clearly not right, and so the question is, what distortion should we put in the model that we teach, or in the model that we use to think about things? It could be that most of the time nominal rigidities is really the dominant one, and in special times the others come in. Or it could be that they're all very relevant. I don't know. I don't have the answer to this. I just wanted to present the case. So I'll stop there.